You're listening to Linked AM. Tell your story on Linked Live and get noticed. You're listening to Carl Wolfenden on the Business Class Show and is not always affiliated with the guests and the topics discussed. Any financial statements are the opinions of the individual, and you should seek professional advice before making any decisions. Upgrade your listening to Business Class, the show that puts you in the big leather comfy seats. So sit back and enjoy our take on the trending business issues of the week.
Howdy, folks. Here he is, the Texas Brit, the guy with the stiff upper lip, filling his 10-gallon hat and his cowboy boots, Carl Wolfenden.
Good morning, and welcome to Linked AM here on Business Class News. And my goodness, I can't believe that we're in the month, well, nearly in the month of May. It's April now, coming up to May. Where's this year gone? But all I know is I've been having some really fascinating conversations about cybersecurity, with everything that's going on in the world, the atrocities that are going on over in Eastern Europe, and we don't need to go into details on that. But I had a guest on last week where we were talking about the fact that the White House has been sending out reminders to business owners that they got to shore up their cybersecurity for obvious reasons. And it was a great conversation. But I think one of the things that came out in my mind was about, well, executives and corporations, they need to start to think ahead. They need to start to plan. And it's not about a situation just arising and then you have to be, sort of scurrying around and trying to fix it as it happens. So a couple of months ago now, I had a friend of mine on, Marty Strong, who wrote a book called Be Nimble. And Be Nimble was because, of course, Marty is a retired Navy SEAL, and he wrote this book about the strategy of how you can align a Navy SEAL's mentality with business. And I was intrigued and I loved that book. And then I found out he's written another one. It's due to come out. And I got Marty on the line right now in the virtual studio. And so, Marty, thanks for joining me today.
Hey, how you doing, Carl?
I'm doing fantastic. We've become good friends over the past few months. And, as I say, I mean, your military background, and we talked about Vets for Vets and my military background, etc. There is a huge alignment, and that's why I so enjoyed reading Be Nimble, because it was showing the tactics of how you've really got to start to align business strategies with forward thinking and being adaptable and being flexible and etc. But you've written this new book called Be Visionary. And I'm reading it here now, A Strategic Leadership in the Age of Optimization. So first of all, what are the differences with the two? Is it sort of a continuation of Be Nimble, or explain a little bit more about that?
Sure. So Be Nimble, and I wrote that probably almost 2 years ago, the initial drafts before it goes into the whole process and a year of marketing it. Looking for talent, hiring, firing, training, retaining, mentoring, coaching, all those things that are kind of like the bread and butter in the trenches day to day of any leader. And that's kind of what that book was all about. One of the chapters I wrote about strategy, just one chapter out of 22 or so. And one of the people that were reading it, and when it was in its draft form, came back, a CEO, and said, This is great. You kind of hit a kernel here. Why don't you write a whole book on this? And so by the time I had released the book to the publisher, and I was going to see it again for quite a long time, I started fleshing out the idea of vision versus strategy. What is strategy? What is dreaming? All those different concepts of looking forward and looking at what is the art of the possible and contemplating that. So that's kind of what I segued into. It's not necessarily a 1-2 punch from being able to be visionary, but I think if you read one and read the other, they're compatible. You maybe a little bit different on where you are in your organization.
So you use the word optimization. I mean, that word is thrown out a lot in organizations. Oh, we got to optimize our output. We got to optimize the way that we go and find revenue, etc. We got to optimize production as such. And I think when I read the book, it was a case of, okay, yes, you've got all these different silos of your organization, but you got to be creative. You've got to be creative with your vision of how you're going to put those things into place. But what do you mean by, in this world of optimization? I'm just curious to understand that bit.
Sure. My theory, from observation and personal experience and some study and research, about 25 years ago, maybe 30 years ago at the most, technology started to enhance the management of things and people. The kind of the natural outcome of that was the ability, it's scientifically, because the technology is essentially a scientific approach to measurement. So no more guessing, no more estimates, no more, sticking your finger up in the air and seeing which way the wind blows. You're going to get highly accurate, very frequent, could be hourly, could be by the minute, depends on what kind of business you're in, data input, where you are, whether you're in a vehicle, whether you're looking at widgets coming off an assembly line, whether you're looking at the cost of the raw materials to make the widget on the world commodities markets. This stuff is coming at you hard and fast and in great granularity. So what management has done over time, I believe, is it started to evolve into an organism that absorbs, analyzes, and then stacks up the measurements and records it and reports it. And they keep doing that. And everybody feels like it's an insurance policy, because what you're doing really is you're measuring history, right? You're measuring the past. It's like the difference between an accountant and a finance person. A finance person is supposed to look at the future and model the future and help you with projections and all those things. An accountant is counting what happened before. So sometimes you get a finance person that has an accounting mindset, and rarely do you get an accountant that has a finance mindset. But anybody that's listening to this that's ever tried to hire a finance executive to be a finance executive knows what I'm talking about, because you ask them a question, well, what do you think is going to happen next year? And they stare at you, unless they are a true financial professional at that level. So yeah, I'm watching this, and the other kind of phenomenon happening at the same time was corporations, publicly traded corporations in America, started to focus on shorter and shorter and shorter timeframes and focused more and more on immediate gratification of shareholder value. So it was happening in the big companies, and it trickled down, it goes to the B schools, they teach it as the way to manage. And management isn't leadership, as I point out in the first book, but managers who don't know that think they're leading. And their vision is about as far as they want to look out into the future that they can measure accurately, because that's the new standard. And anybody that comes up with some wild idea about, let's talk about what's going to happen next year, it's like white blood cells on a virus. Stomp that idea out. When we get there, we'll measure it, we'll figure it out incrementally, week by week, and we'll be okay. It will be safe. And that's kind of the basis of my theory, my observations, and that's why in the subtitle I put it's kind of a strategic versus optimization thing. Strategy is the enemy of optimization, and vice versa in my mind.
Because I'm listening to what you're saying there, and I hear all the time, instant gratification seems to be the way. AI is, as you say, creating these data reports, etc., and these people that are just churning these things out, they lose sight of where they are where they're going, I think. And the problem that somebody will face is if they only look this far down the line and they don't look this wide, then they're going to lose competition. Because you talk about be nimble with your first book, there are companies now that are flexible, nimble, they can turn on a dime, and if you don't put the right infrastructure in, you're going to be left behind. And so you've got to have that strategy, don't you? And have that vision. But I don't know if companies actually allow that for their managers to become creative. Michael Steiner and I have talked about, being resilient and having sort of different types of mindsets within organizations as such. And we've said corporations need to start to make or allow their management to be creative so that new ideas can blossom and you can be visionary. But I don't know if corporations are actually embracing that, are they? They should be.
They should be. I think the dynamic that's occurring, and there's lots of historical references for it. Steve Jobs being fired by his own board because he basically wasn't becoming conventional enough to make them all feel comfortable and safe. They all wanted nice and steady, easygoing, and he would come up with ideas, like the iPod and the iPhone and all the engineers said it was impossible. Then the engineers would start to complain, and that would bubble up to the board, and the board said something's wrong with Steve. Nothing was wrong with Steve. The reason why Steve fired so many people as he was moving up, because those people were trained in school how to follow the rules of engineering. When we first saw, you're old enough and I'm old enough, when we saw the first cell phone that was, the size of a 50 caliber ammo can, and it lasted for about, 20 minutes on a charge. Okay, there you go. If somebody said, yeah, but in about 30 years, they're going to be the size of a pack of cigarettes, and they're going to have the computing power of a NASA spaceship. You're like, yeah, whatever. Well, but it happened. It isn't because it can't happen. It's because people are convinced they shouldn't try to think that it might happen, because it throws what you're doing right now into kind of a disarray. Because what if you are building infrastructure? What if you're building infrastructure from 1974, but it's 2022? I don't care what industry you're in. Look at the space industry. Let's get everything safe. We did all the great stuff at the end of the 60s. We went to the moon. Now let's get it safe, keep it safe. Let's build a bus that takes stuff up and down, the space shuttle. Let's not try too many other things. And then boom, you got SpaceX and you got the X Prize, and people that didn't care about the rules suddenly started doing all kinds of crazy stuff in space that they were told they couldn't do by NASA and by other people. They were wrong. So, there's so many examples of it. It's just why, back to your question, why doesn't a company do what it needs to do to grow and be creatively predictive about what the future of that company should look like? And my thought is, you very rarely get people leading infrastructure that are dynamic and flexible enough, first book, Be Nimble, that can react and follow the lead of a dynamic, creative, visionary CEO or somebody at the top. There's always a disconnect. And then the other one is, if you have a whole lot of very creative people, this happens a lot in technology, that are down in the infrastructure, they're banging their head against this, steel plate, because the people that are at the top, for one or two reasons, either they were those people and now they've arrived, they're in their 40s or 50s and they don't need to take risks anymore, and so they don't want to listen, or they just are people that don't take risks, don't take chances, don't look very far. They love give me my KPI feedback report today. That makes me feel like I'm in charge of the universe. So if you can get them, obviously a company's in trouble if you get kind of a sluggish infrastructure and a sluggish senior leadership, and they can take off, and sometimes they can burn out if you get the combination of everybody's creative and everybody's crazy. So in the book, I do emphasize that optimization is what you do when you put the plan, the stretch for the stars in place, and you optimize that plan of execution. You don't use optimization as a replacement for strategic and visionary thinking.
I think we've been doing these features on the vision of the workforce, the future workforce, etc. And what I like about what you're talking about there and what's in the book is that I think we've got to start to evolve the new influx of talent that's coming in to be able to have that mix. Because I think what I'm hearing you say, you've got to have that mix. You've got to have, your strategic thinkers, you've got to have those creative thinkers, etc. But they've got to work as a team. and really sort of, have an end goal in mind. So take me through the journey of the book, because what I like how you set the tone up front, but tell me how you take a reader through your book, so that they understand what you're trying to sort of portray there.
Well, I start out essentially doing what we just did, trying to explain to the reader that it's human nature to be risk adverse. It's human nature to get stuck in a rut of your own knowledge and your own expertise. I mean, that's what people do. You double down on what you know. It's human nature to hire people that are just like you. It's human nature to be subjective, not objective. These are all things that are normal human characteristics. So once you recognize how that's holding you back or how that's inhibiting you from thinking, dreaming of visions of what you could be, what your company could be, what your family could be. It could be what your country could be, your state could be. Because what it does is it restricts you. And if you address it in the first part of the book, understanding those restrictions, recognizing you have a problem is the first step to fixing the problem. So I try to do a lot of that, a lot of my own examples, and time when I would come in and I've kind of come up with this idea of it's an oblique objectivity, which is different than kind of internal objectivity. So you tell somebody to think outside of the box. Usually the people you're telling to think outside of the box live in the box. They're basically creatures of the box. So now they're supposed to suddenly try to think what it's like to not be a creature living in the box. There's a certain amount of value to that, and that's a good exercise. But an oblique objectivity is when you bring in somebody who's never been in the box, doesn't even know what a box is, doesn't know the shape of a box, and you ask them questions, or you become informed by their impressions and ideas about what you're doing. An example would be, I'm a Navy SEAL who helped start up a healthcare company without a healthcare background. That question came up all the time. Christmas parties, there's a CEO, doctors would come up, oh, so what kind of medicine do you practice? I don't. I used to slide down ropes and kick down doors, and they look at me like I have 3 heads. But it's true. And I've met other people in healthcare that are challenging the status quo of healthcare, and it happens in all industries. It's just not talked about in business schools, and it's not talked about in formal business books that try to become, large corporation textbooks and actual textbooks in schools, because it's that asymmetrical attack on the body. We like it the way it is. Schools are historians, they're teaching the way it has been. Books that align with that are very popular. But if you come in and say, I know a guy who was a general contractor for 6 years, helping build and repair apartment buildings, and he's got an incredible, quick growing laboratory services company all through the East Coast and down into the Southeast of the United States. And you ask, well, how can you convey, because he used a gig economy approach and his expertise in subcontracting management, which you have to have in construction, to be able to basically swarm a market with quicker, more agile, mobile units that were able to deliver things, and then cut really hard deals like you would do again with your subcontractors, with all the different lab services and everything, and he upped the game because nobody was trying to up the game. That's the oblique objectivity, coming in from left field. You don't know anything about anything. So that's a valuable thing. It's hard to do. You can't just snap your finger and become that person, but you have value in a lot of different engagements if you understand that. And if other people understand that, they'll invite you in because they want that different insight. So these are all things that I talk about in the first part of the book. And then I kind of segue into the mechanics. How do you put it together?
I think, that's the bridge, the gap that a lot of people have difficulty with, is they know what they need to do. They need to be able to have, I think there's a word for unconscious bias, in terms of that's what the mindset is. You have that tendency to gravitate to where you feel comfortable, etc. And organizations do that all the time, leaderships, and they're trying to get away from that. That's a big thing that people are talking, saying, oh, it's unconscious bias. You've got to be careful that you don't just, that's diversity and inclusion that we talk about. But from an ideas perspective, one of the things that, I'm going to ask you a question now.
Okay.
Will you come back on the show and be on with Michael Steiner and me and have a debate on how we can start to, shape the future of the workforce? Because I think that'd be a fascinating conversation.
Yeah, rejuvenate creativity. Yeah.
Well, it is. I mean, because I think we've got to re-educate corporations, and I think I encourage. I mean, because it's. I mean, I know it's already written and published, etc. It's due for release at the beginning of next year, as such. But at the end of the day, Be Visionary is a book that I think should be read by corporate executives to really understand how they can take their company forward. Because, as I said in the preamble, a lot of companies at the moment are scrambling because they haven't been visionary, they haven't been planning, they've not been creative, and now all of a sudden somebody turns up across the street, opens the storefront, and goes, "We can do this better, faster, and nimbler." And the company's going, "Whoa, what just happened?"
Right.
The blinkers were on.
And the answer to what just happened is usually they did it different.
They did it different.
They didn't do the same way you did it, or all the competitors you're consciously aware of. They sat in a room someplace and came up, and maybe because they were one of those oblique, objective, players that just sat in a room one day and said, "Well, let's try this." Okay, and they didn't know any better, and boom.
Well, I had I can't remember the young lady, Petra, that's what she's called. Anyway, I had a great interview a couple of years back now, and we had an interesting this is what happens on these conversations, and this is why I love it. I go one direction, and all of a sudden something goes off, and then we start talking about something else. But that's the value of these conversations. And we were talking about how it's so important to have an advisory board that is diverse, that somebody that hasn't been in the business, and she was saying that it doesn't matter what business it is, get people around you that have an opinion and be able to sort of voice it. And don't just go and look, like you just said, for the people that are in the industry as your advisors, because all you'll do is you'll find that you're actually they're advising you to go down the same path as everybody else. But if you go and find somebody on your advisory board that is outside of that box that you just talked about, it's exactly what the conversation was. And that's what I love, what I just heard you say, because it's true. You've got to have that outside perspective, because it's going to make you, think, wow, if we did it this way, which is completely off the wall, but if we can do it, we're gonna make millions. And that's what you need, a spark, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, divergent thinking, the context is it's divergent from your thinking.
Yes.
So you have to find people that don't think like you. If you're a linear thinker, find somebody who's nonlinear. If you're a nonlinear thinker, find a linear thinker, because there's value in all these different angles of attack and problem solving. And there are people that have a high tolerance for risk, low tolerance for risk. There are people that can move very, very fast, think very fast. Others are very deliberative and thoughtful. And, they all kind of, if you throw them all in the soup, they all catch each other and kind of reinforce each other's strengths and weaknesses. And that's a great, I don't care if it's a board of directors or if it's a management team, or as I say in the book, find those different kinds of people within your own organization and create essentially an incubation cell with all the creatives. And that's who you want in there. You want people that are willing to try something crazy, or talk about something crazy, or write down something crazy, or test something crazy. And then the other group, which is kind of your staunch, it's never going to work kind of people, but they're professionals, they're technically very, very capable. And what you do is you use that as the grinding stone. So the creative side takes, say, I come up with a vision. I go through this kind of step by step in the book, but say I come up with a vision on the CEO. what am I going to do if I turn around and my senior leadership all believe in, KPI narration, and they don't understand how to take an idea and turn it into something. So if I had this kind of structure, I could say, okay, I'm going to toss this to the creative team. And this isn't an art creative team, but the concept's been around in art and advertising and other things like that, marketing. All right, you guys get together. It's a project team. I want you to take this thing, flip it around, turn it around, toss it in the air, stomp on it, whatever you got to do. And then I want some feedback in, say, 2 weeks of what you guys thought about it. Now, if it gets to the point where it starts to form and shape and start to look like an actual concept instead of just an idea, then you have them flesh it out to the point where you can hand it to the grinder, which is the people that they're salivating, waiting to kill it. But there's rules, right? So you say, all right, you have to test it. So if the world is flat and they've got evidence that if you keep on walking, you're just going to end up where you started, it's going to take a while. You have to accept that. You can't say, no, I don't agree with that. You have to accept what you find or what is presented to you. They're going to find faults. They're going to find errors. They're going to find disconnects with the physics of business or the way money works or something. Great. That informs your concept. That improves your concept. And if it gets past that point, now it's worth putting to a team that knows how to build an operations plan. And then they're going to flesh it out, pull the resource demands out of it. And now you've basically got a pitch. And I talk about how to pitch, the resource agents, whether it's management or whether it's outside banks or, venture capital, because you go through that whole process, you walk in there and you've already had it basically bench tested within your own organization. And it's not just the idea of bench tested, it's actually a business concept with numbers, timelines, outcomes, and all that. So yeah, it's a primer in doing what I just described, mostly for the second half of the book. And it's not that hard to do. You just have to be willing to, tap those people and those resources in your organization.
Well, as I always say, when I read books like yours, it's not hard to do, but you got to take somebody like yourself who put it down on paper and actually have them. At the end of the day, it's building habits, isn't it? And cultural habits within organizations. And if you can try and create this culture of what you just described and you describe in the book, then again, as I say, there's always, I talk to executives all the time. They say, yeah, I can, but I don't know how to get from this end point where the creativity, etc., to actually the execution, and you talk about it, optimization of that particular project. They don't know how to do it. So your book actually shows them a roadmap of how they can do that. I mean, it's just
Sure.
And you put it in real life situation. So
the bridge in my experience is a couple of decades in business. After a couple of decades, asking every time somebody said why, you just responded with why not. And when you're in the special operations community, the reason you exist is to do the things that aren't conventional, that aren't already pre-planned and pre-resourced. Nobody's going to ask a SEAL unit of 15, 16, 20 guys to charge Mount Suribachi in the Pacific and hold an island in an airfield. There's forces for that. There's the Marines for that, right? So special operations, by its very nature, like the British SAS, they're saying is who dares wins. It's basically you have to take a chance at solving a problem that people think is either not solvable or it's going to be very difficult to solve with consequences attached to it. And it's not going to happen every week, every month for the next 20 years. That would make it a conventional requirement. It's going to be unconventional. So you gather people that think like that. You train people to think like that, to continue to think like that. You try to make them operate within some practical terms. They still have to work within kind of the art of warfare and the restrictions of time and space and all that. But you get an attitude that isn't, the hell with it, I'll take any risk, it doesn't matter. It's actually hyper calculated intellectual evaluation of a multitude of ways to slice the apple. I mean, an incredible number. It's a very dynamic mission planning experience. Eventually, you start to pull it all together. And like I said earlier, some of it doesn't fit. Somebody's idea does fit. You put all those increments together in your mission phase line, and then you brief it. Sometimes you rehearse it, and they tell you go. And 9 times out of 10, you get there, and as they would say in Britain, it was all bollocks up because the intel was wrong, and so you have to make a plan on the fly. But but that's the experience, and again, that's it. You know, it's going to be there. It's not going to be there. That guy's going to be there. That guy wasn't there. The weather is going to be this. That's not the way the weather was. You know, that's the reality when you get there, and then you have to be flexible and nimble enough to deal with that, you know, in the moment. So yeah, and then if that was my mindset and that was my background and training from the special operations experience, going into business was, you know, how do you take that kind of attitude or aptitude and turn it into something in the commercial world? Well, first you have to learn how to be a businessman. You have to learn how to make things and how much things cost, you know, and that whole experience was kind of the secondary effect. Be visionary kind of encapsulates both those experiences.
Well, Marty, unfortunately, we're coming up to the end of the segment, but as always, you know, as we say, we don't plan to fail. You know, you plan to succeed, but you have to have those sub plans and be flexible and nimble, as you just said. Thank you for your words of wisdom. Be Visionary is an amazing read, and you know, I'm going to be putting all the links on this post underneath this podcast and the video, because we'll be sharing the video as well, because of our clean shaven faces and all that good stuff. But yeah, Marty, fantastic. And I do want you to come back on with Michael Steiner and I, because I think it'd be an amazing, it'd just be an interesting conversation just to capture.
That'd be
because
fun.
I think who knows what will come out of that conversation, but it's going to be good. Well, Marty, thanks again for spending time. I know you're really busy, and you know, as I say, your words of wisdom are always welcome.
Thanks for having me, Carl.
Fantastic. Of course, that was Marty Strong, the author of Be Visionary, the Strategic Leadership in the Age of Optimization. And I get all the links are below about pre-ordering and all that good stuff, and also some contact information for Marty as well. What I love about these conversations, they do go into different directions. And that's usually my fault, because, you know, I try and plan it out, and then I tell the guest that this is where we're going to go, and I just completely blow it up. But it's fun, because I think what came out of that conversation was the fact that it's not about just being visionary. It's not about just being creative. It's about really having a culture of people and a mix of different personalities and leadership roles, etc., to make sure that, yeah, you are going to be in a position to succeed, and you do plan to succeed. And, you know, if something doesn't work, then, you know, pivot, but you're going to have a plan to put that into place. So, as I say, the book Be Visionary is a must read. So, as I say, as I always talk to you people, as I end the show, go out there, have some fun, make some money, because it's business class news, and, you know, always be safe. So until the next time, goodbye.